Well, it's been several weeks since Alberta Premier Danielle Smith handed out her mandate letters to her ministers. So what will this look like as the legislature resumes its session in the fall? Here to discuss that and Smith's fight with the energy sector is our legislative reporter and Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, welcome. Thanks for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's just jump right into Smith versus renewable energy. Okay, so there's some disagreement on whether or not Alberta can reach new clean electricity targets set by the federal government. So the UCP says Alberta cannot reach that 2035 deadline and that a target date of 2050 is more like it. But the NDP says that we can reach that federal deadline. Yes, we can. So Tyler, tell us more.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation. So last week, the federal Liberals came out with their clean electricity regulations, which basically say that by 2035, every province in Alberta needs to have a net zero electricity grid. This is not a massive challenge for a number of provinces. British Columbia and Quebec, for example, have quite a bit of hydro. Ontario has a relatively low emissions electricity grid, but there are sort of four provinces here that are in for a bit of trouble, and that's Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Of course, the one we're concerned about here is Alberta, and the bulk of our electricity generation comes from natural gas. There are still a couple coal-fired electricity plants, but primarily we're talking natural gas. And Alberta is not particularly well integrated into the sort of broader electricity market. So, one of the ways that we could lower our emissions intensity would be to get involved in the BC electricity market, maybe buy some of our electricity from BC, which would be hydro, which would be, lower emissions. So basically what the UCP are saying is, look, this just isn't possible. So much of this is natural gas. This would require colossal investments in carbon capture and sequestration. This would require massive investments in wind and solar, perhaps some small nuclear reactor stuff. So the costs here are going to be fairly substantial, and the UCP says, look, it's just not possible. Now, the NDP say that it is possible, and it potentially is. It just would require a lot of money. But the interesting thing on the NDP front is the Alberta NDP says it's possible. The Saskatchewan NDP says it isn't, and of course the federal NDP is a bit wishy-washy on it. So it's a sort of an interesting political question where there's not a whole lot of agreement within the New Democrats about whether or not this is feasible. And certainly this is shaping up to be something that Danielle Smith is going to fight with Ottawa over.
Tyler, do you think that we could see that Sovereignty Act enacted, especially since Alberta has long fought back legally against federal rules that it doesn't like, and it also has passed that Sovereignty Act? So could we see it come into play here?
I think we could. I think probably the first step in this process on the clean electricity regulations is some sort of constitutional fight. Alberta did this with Bill C-69, that created the Impact Assessment Act and the Impact Assessment Agency federally. We did this on the carbon tax. In neither case was Alberta's legal argument persuasive to the courts. But certainly there is the jurisdictional question here of whether or not Ottawa can sort of create these new regulations on provincial electricity systems. So I certainly think we're going to see a legal fight. Whether or not that will be successful is another question. And then, I do suspect that we'll certainly hear some Sovereignty Act talk. Whether or not they go ahead and use it is maybe a different question. And of course, the overarching question is, what would that actually do? What can the Alberta government do with the Sovereignty Act that would prevent these rules from coming into place? And I think that's probably something that the UCP's strategists are looking at right now, because I don't think it's super clear on its face what they would do.
Okay, so still on the energy file here, the Alberta government has initiated a 6-month pause on the approval of renewable energy projects, but Premier Danielle Smith hasn't been entirely clear why that happened. So Tyler, do you have any ideas?
No, it's sort of anyone's guess. At this point, she was asked why this moratorium was announced, and said that, Alberta had been asked by the Alberta Utilities, I'm blanking on what it's called, but they're the body that approves projects.
The commission?
Yes, the Alberta Utilities Commission. Thank you. Yeah. That's what she said, that they had asked for a pause, and that also the Alberta Electricity Systems Operator had asked for a pause. And she pointed out these two letters that had been sent to the government, but neither of them asked for this moratorium. So bit confusing
Right.
there what's going on. What we do know is certainly that her rural constituency and some of the rural municipalities are a little bit concerned about this in terms of the effect on the landscape, the effect of sort of land reclamation once these projects reach end of life, that sort of thing. So a bit unclear, the sort of immediate cause, but certainly there are some concerns in that rural constituency. And this basically just looks like a 6-month pause on any new project approvals. The issue that is arising is that the renewable energy sector sort of says they weren't consulted on it. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. I think there's something like 90 projects in the pipeline right now. So it's certainly injected a little bit of uncertainty into that sector, which is, a booming sector for Alberta. So there's conspiracy theories floating around that this is, a way to help oil and gas and destroy the green energy sector. But the government sort of insists that this is just taking a little bit of time to get it right.
Okay. All right. Well, changing gears here, we're going to talk about motor vehicles. So, as of September 1st, there are some new rule changes, some changes to the road coming into place. So, regarding what motorists must do around emergency vehicles. So, if you're in that lane closest to the flashing lights, you need to slow down to 60 or change lanes. But, Tyler, not everyone is happy with that.
No, and it has to do with basically a watering down, shall we say, of the rules. When it's mainly the fire chiefs, I think, who've raised concerns about this, and their impression during their sort of consultations and discussions with government was that, say you're on Highway 2, 3 or 4 lanes. Originally, they were under the impression that everyone was going to have to slow down or move over going past emergency vehicles. And the rules that are coming in September 1st, it's just that closest lane that's going to have to slow down or move over. So, if you're in the far left lane or the far right lane, you can carry on at 110. And so the government says, look, it's a dangerous situation on the roads when you have people slowing down suddenly to 60. It's best to have people sort of staying at their original velocity when they're further away from emergency vehicles. So that's what the government's saying. Some of the emergency responders are not very happy about what they see as the watering down of these rules. But the other notable thing on this is that it now includes tow truck drivers. So it's not just police and fire, but it does include sort of other first responders as well. So is a little bit of a change for people who are going to be out on the roads in September and October and
Yeah, definitely.
for the future.
Absolutely. I'm sure those fire chiefs are just thinking about safety first, the safety of everyone. Okay, so Tyler, it's been a couple of weeks since those mandate letters for ministers have been dished out, but it's worth revisiting one of the ideas that we're likely to hear about a lot in the weeks and months ahead, which is the UCP is still planning to introduce what is called a Compassionate Intervention Act, which would basically set up a regime to force people into care for opioid addiction. So this is kind of controversial. So what might we see happening this fall when the legislature returns?
Yeah, and it's funny that it's called the Compassionate Intervention Act, as you said. And I was actually speaking with Dan Williams, the mental health and addiction minister, the other day, and he talked about the Compassionate Intervention Act. And we got to the end of the conversation. I said, we didn't talk about the sort of forcible treatment thing. And he said, oh, you mean the Compassionate Intervention Act? And I said, oh, that's what you're calling it. The name a little bit, I think, disguises what's going on there for better or worse. And so that, I think, is going to be really, really controversial. I think it's going to be complicated in terms of how it's set up, who's making these decisions. Alberta does already have the ability to sort of force people into treatment under mental health rules. You can be sort of under a mental health hold for 24 hours kind of thing, put in a psych facility. So I would imagine, and this is just me speculating, that it'll follow that model a little bit, but it's going to be controversial. I'm going to be very curious to see where the NDP comes down on it, how open to collaboration the UCP is going to be on it, what sort of consultations they do on it. And there's almost certainly going to be a constitutional challenge on it as well. And so it'll be, I don't think it's super clear whether or not that would survive a constitutional challenge. So the politics of it's going to be very interesting, just how they're going to set it up, how they're going to make it happen. The other side of the politics, how are the NDP going to respond to it? Right. And then there's the legal side, of course, which is whether or not this is going to be challenged in court.
There's a lot to it, yeah.
There is. And, this is just one part of their sort of much larger opioid and mental health strategy, but I certainly think it's going to be one of the most controversial, and it's going to be a real challenge, I think, to write that legislation in a way that makes people happy.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think it could be classified as a human rights violation as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly going to be the argument that some people are making. Whether or not that's the legal argument that ends up in court,
Sure. Yeah.
it is I'm not totally certain what the legal arguments would be. But yeah, I mean, certainly, I think it's going to be a question of, is it a violation of human rights to sort of force people into medical care who don't want it? In other contexts, that's been really, really controversial, as we've seen in the last couple of years. So I do think there's going to be quite a large controversy over it, and it's going to be a hard road, I think, for the UCP. Like, I just think it's a hard sell for a lot of people, and there is certainly support for it. There's been some support from First Nations communities, for example, so there is going to be some support, but I certainly think they're going to face a ton of opposition in trying to get this done.
Interesting. Okay, moving along here. As we saw when those mandate letters came out, the UCP might be ditching its plan for a provincial police force, but then again, they might not. So, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, the main evidence for them ditching the plan is that it didn't appear in the mandate letters. People will remember that a couple of years ago, the UCP put a lot of energy and a lot of political capital into trying to sell this idea. They had a very, very thorough analysis of, right down to the equipment that would need to be purchased, the number of officers per detachment, all that kind of stuff, to sort of pitch this as a viable idea. And there was not a lot of enthusiasm for it. I don't think you even had a majority of people who were UCP members or UCP voters favoring it. And certainly some of the rural municipalities, even though they've been dealing with rural crime, even though they've had concerns about the RCMP's response, they, were not fully on board with this. So it was always going to be a very hard sell, I think. Especially because the costs were probably going to be higher, but it didn't appear in the mandate letter. So that does raise the question of, well, is this a dead idea? Is this dead in the water? Are we not going ahead with it? And the government has sort of said, there's going to be some discussions and consultations and things like that. So this is more one that I think is worth keeping an eye on, whether or not we do hear anything about it, or if it is just going to be one of those policy ideas that fades away over time.
Okay, it's not necessarily a provincial politics story, but let's talk a little bit about. There's a number of municipalities that have declared a state of agricultural disaster, primarily in central and southern Alberta. It's really sad, really dry down here. So there have been a handful of bad agricultural years recently, actually. So what's going on, Tyler?
Yeah, so I mean, it's primarily due to the heat and lack of rain or sporadic rain that sort of led to widespread crop failures across sort of southern Alberta, and actually into most of Saskatchewan as well is sort of facing a similar problem. But it's not just crops that have failed. For ranchers, this is also a problem. Their pastures have dried up for feed, and feed prices are at record highs. So some people are having to sell off some of their herds. And there are provincial policies and programs that are in place. They've sort of expanded some of the insurance options available, and there's options to try and, if you're going to get 10% of your crop or something like that, where that might be sold perhaps for livestock feed as opposed to going for food production for humans, that sort of thing. So there are some provincial and federal government responses to that, but as you say, this is just sort of the latest in a string of pretty tough years for farmers and ranchers in Alberta.
Okay, we're going to switch gears totally here. Here's a kicker for you. Remember that donair costume the Alberta government had? So this thing looked like a life-size donair, complete with lettuce and sauce and meat. It actually looked kind of tasty. Maybe some people think it looked gross. I don't know. So they put it up for sale, and believe it or not, it's been sold. So Tyler, who was the lucky winner?
The lucky winner of this auction was an Edmonton-based chain called Primetime Donair and Poutine. They spent $16,025 was the winning bid.
Wow.
This went up for auction in sort of mid-July and really captivated people, I think, because it was just very weird. It was like, why does the Alberta government own a Donair costume?
Bizarre.
Totally bizarre. And, Danielle Smith ended up, meeting the Donair at, I think, the Taste of Edmonton and Edmonton Food Festival. And so all these reporters, because of course it's summer, so we have nothing going on.
Right.
We had lots of time to figure out where the heck this donair came from. And
Okay.
the answer to that is it was an impaired driving campaign. It was supposed to be for people who had smoked marijuana and were stoned and wanted to go get a donair. And this donair costume was supposed to be a character called the Wise Donair. that was going to counsel people against driving while high. And this was, it goes way back. This has been sitting in a storage room since the PCs were in power. And it was actually Rachel Notley's government that kiboshed the commercial. So it's been sitting around, and I'm curious to see what primetime Donair is going to do with that outfit.
So it's an old stale Donair, maybe
It's
maybe
old and
not as
rusty.
fresh as it looks. Dust it off a little bit.
Exactly.
Well, it looks like we're almost out of time here, but Tyler, thanks so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks so much.